All right, welcome back. I have gotten a little behind, as I always do, mostly because of Animal Crossing. But I am going to be recording our lecture today on fairness and diversity. I'll probably also get through the leadership lecture as well. So we're going to start with fairness and diversity, which is going to be a little bit shorter than some of the other ones, mostly because a lot of the content from it is kind of just stuff that I've been lacing through many of our lectures. So it's going to sound familiar. It's going to be more explicitly included in this lecture. And if you have any questions, let me know. I'm hoping that this one will have a bit of conversation around it. I really encourage you guys, especially for this lecture, to take to the forums and talk about some of the things that are in it and other things that you might find relevant to the topic. So with that said, let's just go ahead and get started on this lecture. Okay. Hopefully you're seeing my screen now. And there we go. Okay. So for this week, I use a theme every week, and I thought I would use Star Trek, which is probably my most nerdy thing that I could possibly pick. And you guys are probably way too young to really know anything about this. Forgive me if I'm wrong about that. I'm also actually quite a bit too young for it, but fortunately I grew up in a family full of nerds, so I grew up with Star Trek. And the reason I chose Star Trek for fairness and diversity is because this show, especially this original series here with Captain Kirk and company, was very much ahead of its time. It came out in the 60s during the civil rights era, and it was a lot of the episodes and a lot of the content was kind of just allegories and metaphors for what was going on in our social world. And sci-fi and fantasy stories actually serve really well to talk about that stuff. And I might be kind of getting off topic here, but this specific show, during the civil rights era, had a Black woman who was one of the top commanding officers in the entire fleet, and it had a Russian scientist on board during the Cold War era. So it definitely broke a lot of stereotypes. It had the first interracial kiss on television, so it was definitely trying to be very forward thinking. In addition to the technology aspect, also in social aspects. And according to the legend story of Star Trek, it takes place at a time that Earth has gone through like World War III, and at the end of World War III came out basically with world peace, no more discrimination, no more problems. So I decided that because of that setting, where everything's perfect on Earth, but we're running into these new problems, or old problems, as I should say, because they're all metaphors for real societal problems, in space, it's basically the diversity topic. And now that I've gotten my little nerd rant out, we can actually get into the content. So diversity, of course, is a big hot topic, and fairness comes along with it. And fairness and diversity are not the same, so I should say that first. So fairness refers to things that we've kind of talked about before: perceptions of justice and trust, psychological contract, these things people perceive support from the organization, bias, all of these things have to do with fairness. And while those are very often largely associated with the topic of diversity, by definition, they're different things, right? So you can have fairness or bias or whatever, and it be a separate issue from diversity, which just generally means variability in people, differences, and those types of things. But they definitely, of course, tend to go along with each other quite often, because a lot of times there's issues of unfairness and bias due to diversity and discrimination. But for the first portion of this, I'm just going to talk a little bit more about that fairness piece. And I got into it briefly in the last lecture, I believe, talking about justice, and that's what we're going to get into in depth in this part of the lecture. So the first thing I could talk about here is trust and organizational justice. And so trust and organizational justice, they're sometimes defined almost interchangeably. However, they are not. I think it makes more sense for them to be differentiated. Specifically, that trust has to do with your belief in how something is going to go, and justice is sort of the actual way that it goes, right? So they're going to have kind of a reciprocal relationship where the more trust you have, probably the more justice you're going to receive, and vice versa. I would imagine that justice probably predicts trust a bit more, but it definitely, they predict each other to some extent. So trust can be undermined in a few different ways, specifically within the organization. And I've talked a little bit about some of these ways before, but to be very clear, one of them is that unmet expectation that I talked about last time in psychological contract breach. So when you have trust and then it's broken, that's that contract breach. And then your trust, of course, is less likely to come back, or it's going to be weakened, or it's going to be completely gone. The second way that trust can be undermined is the behavior of the leader. So all of the ways that justice occurs are typically through the organization at its higher levels, including and especially the leaders. And if the leader does not behave in a fair and uniform way towards all the workers, trust is undermined. This is all pretty intuitive stuff, but just to give you a clear picture, on top of that, the integrity and the ethical behavior of the leader will also influence trust. And this, of course, again, it's intuitive because it's stuff that's not just true at organizations, it's true in all of our relationships with other people, right? If someone is treating people unfairly interpersonally, if someone is an unethical person, you're probably not going to trust them as much as you would trust someone who is very upright and always, behaving in the same way towards everyone. You can count on that person. So basically, it's all of the same stuff that would apply in the social world can apply to the organization in this case as well. But a third way that is different than maybe your normal interpersonal trust is surveillance, although, this could occur in a relationship, right? So if you're dating a person, or your parents or someone is constantly checking up on you, going through your stuff, that indicates that they don't trust you. And then the norm of reciprocity, which is a social psychology thing that we want to return the behavior that is given to us, indicates that we in turn do not trust that person, right? So the same thing is true in the organization. For example, one of the restaurants I was a server in had cameras up all over the restaurant, and I had customers all the time that would ask like, oh, do you guys have a lot of dine and dashers? Is there theft here? And I would honestly just tell them the truth, which was no, those cameras are not for the customers, they're for us, the workers. My boss would literally watch us from home when she was very sick and in the hospital. She would watch the cameras from her hospital bed and call the restaurant if we were doing something she didn't like. So she didn't trust us at all. And in turn, we didn't really care for or trust. So that's, an example of surveillance resulting in lower perceptions of trust and lower trust. So, I understand that there's an importance of surveillance. I have a camera up outside my house, but there's also an element of kind of what's the cost of doing that I think organizations need to balance, and making sure that their employees feel that the organization is trusting and respecting them, because there's a good possibility, and in fact, we have the research to support the idea that this trust in employees, this respect for employees will return back to the organization in the form of employees also trusting the organization. So definitely something to be thinking about. The next thing that I want to bring up here is more in-depth conversation about organizational justice itself. And again, I mentioned this in the last lecture, and I kind of talked through what they were, but luckily you don't have to memorize all of that. I will be going through it. Well, I mean, you should kind of memorize it, but you didn't have to memorize it just based on me speaking it, because it's going to be laid out on the slides in this lecture. So organizational justice is defined as the type of justice that is composed of the organization's procedures, outcomes, and interpersonal interactions. So if you remember that, procedures or processes for procedural justice, outcomes for distributive justice, and interpersonal interactions for interactional justice. So those are your three main types of justice right here: distributive, procedural, and interactional. And some might say there's really 4 because interactional is made up of 2 subtypes, which are interpersonal and informational, but just remember it as those 3. Although I would definitely recommend learning the interpersonal and informational and the differences because it's going to be on your quiz. I'm telling you right now, these 4 types of justice will definitely be on the quiz for this week. So organizational justice research focused on outcomes initially, and then it started talking about how those outcomes are made and grew to incorporate the extent to which these different treatments influence people's perceptions of justice. So we started out most interested in, what employees are doing, what's happening in the organization, and then kind of worked our way back into what caused those things to happen, which was, the kind of conceptualization of the concept of organizational justice. And the front-running researcher in this field was Greenberg, and in the late 80s, early 90s, he did a lot of research on, employee theft and retaliation, so those counterproductive work behaviors, and found that this concept of justice was heavily related, although that was built on theories that came even before his work. So let's go through these 3 or 4 types of justice one by one. The first one is distributive justice. And as I said a second ago, this kind of has to do with outcomes. So distributive justice is the perceived fairness of the allocation of outcomes or rewards to organization members. So basically, what's the pay? What are the promotions? Who's being fired? Who's being given raises? All of these are considered outcomes to the organizational members or the employees. And how fairly do the employees perceive that these things are being distributed? So you can kind of think of it in those terms, right? Their organization is distributing outcomes, and is it distributing them fairly? That's distributive justice. It can be based on a number of different norms. So the first being equity, who earned it, is the hardest worker and the highest performer getting the raise. The second is need, who deserves it, so someone who's been there the longest maybe. And 3 is equality, which is everyone should be rewarded and recognized uniformly. I think most commonly, especially in the United States, we definitely do the equity or merit aspect. The need may be second most, but definitely not equality, because we are very much of an achievement-oriented culture, and we don't want to just give everyone the same, prize or reward or outcome if they didn't, quote unquote, earn it. But these are our different norms that we have, and I would say that probably most of us have more of an equity or possibly need norm. But that's distributive justice. The second is procedural justice, which, just like the name suggests, is the perceived fairness of the process or procedure by which ratings are assigned or rewards are distributed. And this could go back to kind of like that project I had you guys do, where you were supposed to build a system of performance management or performance appraisal. And the performance appraisal system is probably the most common thing to be related to this type of justice. So are your employees perceiving that that's fair and just, because that's how the decisions are made? So what's the process? So some of the early justice theory came from this person, Leventhal, this researcher. And Leventhal came up with these rules for justice. And this, back in the early days of organizational justice, procedural was kind of the most often used, so it applied to this. Distributive came next, and then interactional justice came with the Greenberg studies I mentioned a bit ago. But the Leventhal criteria were the first ones that really kind of laid out a framework for how justice should be done. So these criteria are as follows. First is consistency, which is that the rules are applied consistently across persons and time. So that seems about right. That's fairness, right? The rules are equal to everyone. Bias suppression, making sure that anyone who has a role in making organizational decisions is impartial and neutral and not showing biases, which is something else that we talked about a lot throughout this class when it came to job analysis, when it came to performance appraisal, and so on. Accuracy of information, which is that the procedures are based on, accurate information, very straightforward. Don't have anyone be lying or making things up or using faulty statistics or anything like that. Correctability, there needs to be some kind of procedure to exist that can correct an outcome that was wrong or mistaken or didn't meet some of the other criteria. Voice is important, so the employees themselves should have the ability to challenge, influence, or object to an outcome. Voice is a common term in organizational research as well that kind of refers to the employees having a voice. So they should be able to challenge things and discuss it as well. They shouldn't be just at the mercy of the leaders. Ethicality is the process that upholds the personal standards of ethics and morality. So, you could dive into some philosophy here with what is ethics and morality, but generally, we have a broad norm or understanding of what that means. And especially within an organization, there's usually some kind of statement or goal that has to do with the norms that are ethical in that organization, along with law and other things like that. And then opportunity to perform. So you have to have all your employees are able to carry out the actions that are needed to attain desired outcome. You can't give some employees more opportunity than others to receive, benefits and rewards, because that's not justice. You have to have, everyone has to have the opportunity to be able to perform at a level that would result in a desired outcome. And if everyone does have that opportunity, that's a criteria of justice. So these are our justice criteria based on the original theories of organizational justice. And that falls under the idea of procedural justice. If you look through them, they definitely apply more to this idea of the procedures than to the other two types. So, okay, going into the last type of justice here, interactional justice, which again is made up of two. It's broadly defined as the sensitivity with which employees are treated, and it's linked to the extent that an employee feels respected by their employer. So it just basically means, are you being treated as someone who is valued and who feels that you're respected and appreciated and that you are being considered? And so, of course, those are the two sub-factors we talked about. Interactions are consisting of these two things. One is interpersonal justice, the degree of respect and propriety authorities figures use when implementing procedures. So this could just simply be the way that they speak to their employees. And it comes down to more than just what they say, but how they interact with their employees. So are they referring to them in respectful ways? Are they making time to listen to their concerns? Are they spending time with the employees? These things are all interpersonal treatment, right? So interpersonal justice. And then informational justice, which is how much they justify and are truthful with information that they are giving the employees. So your employer can interact with you all they want, but if they don't tell you any of the information, you might still feel like something has been happening that's not justice because you're being, information is being withheld. And vice versa, right? They could tell you all the information, but if they do it in a way that's very unfriendly or not present, or they just send you a notice rather than actually talking to you, you might still also feel like you're not being treated with respect. So these two both are important. And this is what it looks like. Your perception as an employee of fairness is made up of a combination of all 3/4 of these types of justice. And there is some research to indicate that you don't necessarily need all of these types of justice to be at play in order to have positive perceptions of fairness. You just need maybe 2 or 3 of the 4. But it's definitely desirable to have as much justice as possible in order to create a better workplace for the employees. And to get more out of the employees as well, because you're going to perform better, you're going to stay with the organization longer, and all these other desired outcomes if you believe that the organization is fair. Those are the main types of justice, and I really want you to think about them, understand them, go back, rewatch, reread, whatever you have to do. Those are probably the most important thing you're going to get out of this lecture. So I definitely just want to emphasize that. But I will move forward a couple more slides before I end this first video and talk about a couple other things with justice. So the first thing is deontic justice. What happens to an employee who feels they have been the victim of injustice? How do they feel, and what actions might they take? Now, I already mentioned this a little bit in this lecture, and I definitely mentioned it in a previous lecture when we were talking about CWB and OCB. Some employees seek to get justice. They seek to take justice into their own hands, even when it's against their own self-interest. And you can, again, apply things that happen outside of the workforce to this, right? So don't get mad, get even type of thing, right? Some employees, if they think something's not being handled with justice, they might say, I'm going to make my own justice. So a form of organizational justice, which is based on what is the correct moral compass of, or moral course of action for a company or an individual. The outcomes are no longer the only thing that matters. Justice is meaningful in and of itself. So this is kind of like a form of justice that the employee is taking into their own hands. So maybe when they go ahead and steal something from the organization, that's the correct course of action for that person, or they think it is because they feel that they're getting even. And that's what we mean by deontic justice. This term probably won't be used too frequently in IO, but it's definitely something to keep in mind. It's kind of more of a broad term of this almost vigilante type justice, but of course in the organizational context, that can mean something like retaliating against the organization. So when you're faced with injustice, we can talk about how that impacts employees. And most of the time, and I've mentioned this also in the past in reference to kind of our emotions lecture and other things, is that negative events and negative things that happen, negative feelings, conflicts, all of these are more impactful than the positive things that happen. So when I say impactful, it means that they are more memorable, they arouse stronger feelings, they make you more likely to act and mobilize in a way. So likewise, the same thing is true with justice. Noticing some type of injustice or feeling injustice in your organization is going to produce stronger reactions in the employees than justice will. Justice is more like the expected norm of what we deserve, and injustice is when employees really respond and react. Not that they don't react to justice, they do, but it's going to be in more subtle ways. So we asked the question, is justice and injustice two ends of a spectrum? Is it a single, line on one end lies justice, on the other end lies injustice? This is an ongoing debate. So with many things with psychology, and I mentioned this in even the personality lecture when we were talking about introversion and extroversion, and also the same thing from emotions, positive and negative affect. Are they two sides of one spectrum? Are they two different things? And again, that's a debate. That's something that people are trying to argue one way or the other. So ask yourself then, to answer this question, could you be working for an organization that is both just and unjust? Could it be true in any aspect of life? Can something be both fair and unfair at the same time? Like most things in psychology, the answer is probably that it depends, right? So that's something like global justice versus facet level justice, meaning, again, that broad versus very narrow or specific type of justice. We've applied this concept to other things as well. Where you can have a broad perception of something, or you can get really specific about what aspects are just or not just. So I think probably, I personally think it's always best to try to view things as separate constructs until proven otherwise, because you might miss some important nuance in findings or in just your research or your observations if you try to group things too much. But I would say if you're looking at a broader justice, probably more like two ends of the spectrum, you're either going to see it or not, and they're going to influence each other. But I would prefer, or I would recommend, looking at the facets of justice and saying, which ones do we see that things are fair and which ones do we see that they are not? Because they're all going to have different impacts on how employees behave. So that's why we like these models that conceptualize justice in different criteria and different types of justice, because we want to be able to really pinpoint if there is a problem, where is it, and if something's going well, how is it going well? And that's going to really help inform better organizational decisions in the long run. So that is the introduction to this concept of justice and fairness. Really, it's the main part of it. So definitely, as I mentioned, keep in mind those different concepts of justice. And I will talk more about some of the ways employees respond to it in the next video.